Thank you for joining us and welcome from the US Middle East Project. My name is Rebecca Abou-Chedid and I'm a renewable energy lawyer by day and by night a non-resident fellow with the US Middle East Project. We're joined today by Deanna Buttu, Peter Beinart, and USMEP President Daniel Levy. A few words on USMEP. We were created inside the Council on Foreign Relations in 1994, but in 2006 became an independent, not-for-profit association and boutique foreign policy institute. We were founded and led throughout those years by Henry Siegman, and we're honored that Henry is with us this evening. With a board of many well-known senior former officials from the US and the region, then chaired by General Brent Scowcroft, who sadly recently passed, and now the most decorated Foreign Service officer in America's history, Ambassador Thomas Pickering. And I'm delighted that both Ambassador Pickering and several of our other board members are on this webinar today as well. USMEP does a lot of its work below the radar screen, in private notes, outreach to decision makers, and supporting grassroots initiatives. We're an organization that is committed to achieving a just, dignified, and mutually acceptable Israeli-Palestinian peace consistent with international law. Israel-Palestine is the emphasis, but we regularly engage in other developments, crises, and even opportunities in the region. Earlier this year, USMEP partnered with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace to produce a path-breaking report entitled Breaking the Israel-Palestine Status Quo. You'll see in the chat box a link to that report. And since late last year, USMEP has had a unique partnership with the International Crisis Group, the only one of its kind. You may have seen some of the joint reports and briefings that have been produced this year in the context of that partnership, including a debrief on the events of May entitled Beyond Business as Usual in Israel-Palestine. This is going to be a conversation between myself, Deanna, and Daniel, and Peter, sorry. We're eager for you to join the conversation and ask you to pose questions in the Q&A box rather than the raise your hand or chat functions. As the speakers refer to materials or reports, we'll include links in the chat box, but we will not be monitoring it for questions. I apologize that in a webinar of this size, we won't get to see or hear all of you in your own voices. We'll keep this moving at the best pace we can so we can cover as much ground and respond to as many of your questions as possible. So let me now turn to the substance. We've gone out on a limb here and used the word hope as a framing for how we're going to approach Israeli-Palestinian dynamics. No doubt that will be a challenge to our guests. So I'll start with USMEP's President Daniel Levy. Daniel, very recently you were asked to brief the United Nations Security Council at their meeting on the Middle East regarding Israel-Palestine. Could you share with us a little bit about what your message was to that world leadership? And as you sat through a long debate and heard from them, what did you hear and what did you learn? Particularly in this time when for the first time in a decade, Benjamin Netanyahu is not leading a coalition as prime minister in Israel.
Well, thanks so much, Rebecca. It's great to have you on board at USMEP, and I'm delighted that Deanna and Peter were kind enough to take from their time to be with us and everyone who's joined us. So that was about a 3-hour debate, and unfortunately at the time, visa rules didn't allow me to be in New York for it, but one gets to listen to or is forced to listen to kind of all the states who are present at the Security Council at the time, and of course the 5 permanent members. And it's quite a depressing listen. It's a regular session they hold, and what you hear is, and I'm sure, by the way, this isn't unique to the regular sessions on Israel-Palestine. I'm sure if I was listening into other things, I'd go, oh my God, the gap, but maybe not as much as on this issue, the gap between what they're saying and the reality on the ground. And it really is a rhetorical feast of meaningless blah. But especially where they found their hope, I think is not where I find my hope, which is in the re-engagement of high-level Israeli officialdom with PA officialdom, with this sense of a resumed cooperation, with this notion that we might now be in an era of so-called shrinking the conflict. And none of that really sounded hopeful to me. And my main message, which I shared with them, was disengage from autopilot, was really try and park some of this very worn rhetoric and look at what the relevant building blocks for peace are. And I don't know what we'll hear. I mean, I know a little bit because I know Deanna and Peter, but I don't know what we're going to hear from them today. But my own starting point is that I've learned with bitter experience that just as international law and international conventions do not self-implement, when there's a violation of those, it doesn't snap back immediately to how those are implemented. So I also think we shouldn't get carried away with the notion that, the overreach of what is being done on the ground while still pretending this is a peace process, this is somehow going to lead to improvements, to a solution, to two states, if you like, that doesn't automatically swing the pendulum back at velocity to an improved situation. The idea that there are gotcha moments which automatically translate, I mean, what just happened with the designation of 6 Palestinian NGOs. So that happens, and some of those NGOs are very well-known human rights defending organizations. That happens just as it gets exposed that some of their staff had been Pegasused by NSO. It happens just as they're offering evidence to international investigations into what Israel is doing in the territories. The idea that there's this gotcha moment in politics, I disagree with. That needs to be driven home. You need politics to drive change, not just, hey, we've caught you out. So where I do find hope and where I'm looking, and this is what I said to the member states there, was that for me there are 3 crucial things that need to be addressed as the building blocks for how we go from a desperate situation we're in now to something that gives us an opportunity to really shift the dynamic on occupation, on inequality, on what it fundamentally is a relatively simple story of an occupying power and an occupied people, and it's the latter who are being denied their freedom and rights. And the 3 things that I drew people's attention to, or tried to at least, were, and it's good to see Hanan Ashrari with us. Those 3 things were, first of all, a deficit of accountability, and I drew this together as 3 deficits. 1, a deficit of accountability when it comes to the Palestinian leadership today. And many of these overlap, and I'm not saying they need to be addressed sequentially, but it really matters when you do not have a movement, a national movement that can speak for Palestinians because it is accountable to its people, because it draws its sustenance, its legitimacy from a consultation with its people. And that is crucial. But the other 2 deficits that I'd like to put to you are, first of all, an accountability deficit. And here's where we have to understand that in Israel, which is not held to account for its policies towards the Palestinians, an Israel that is treated with impunity is extremely unlikely to be an Israel that feels any need to course correct or to question what it is doing, or to revisit in its public debate, in its politics, in its policies. The third thing is a symmetry deficit. And some people say, why do you always bang on about what Israel does? And there's a very simple reason, because there is no symmetry of power here. You have a state with all that is at its disposal, and not any state. This is a powerful state, a regional military superpower, a technological superpower. We've seen how some of the bad uses that is put to being made public recently. So the focus is on Israel because that is where the power resides, and one has to address that asymmetry. Now, I look around and I say, well, okay, how can we start addressing those points? And actually three things have gone on recently, which to me do add a degree of fluidity, do add a degree of uncertainty, and those are threads that we can pull on. Number one, we're in a post-Netanyahu environment. That does not mean that we have a government that's acting fundamentally differently. It does mean, I think, that there's an uncertainty about the direction of travel in Israel. There's certain elements of chaos even that are emerging inside Israeli society. What does it mean? And Diana may well speak to this. What does it mean when you saw this very unusual rallying to the Palestinian cause in May from much of the citizenry of Israel, which is Palestinian, while at the same time you have Mansour Abbas in the government? This dissonance that here is a government that's acting more normal, and yet it's going ahead with the worst settlement expansion. It's doing this designation. It's treating people who try and draw a distinction between Israel and the Green Line in the same way that previous governments did. So I think there's a dissonance and a fluidity which opens up opportunity. On the Palestinian side, I may be over-optimistic, but it feels like the dying embers of the era of the Oslo Palestinian Authority. It feels like the degree of repression, unfortunately, internally, but the degree also to which there is such a disconnect between how they operate and their narrative, that is beginning to hit a wall. And thirdly, and others will address this more, I imagine, Peter especially, on the US side, not only the debate within the US, which I think we have to be cautious, it's still nascent, but also how things are shifting geopolitically and the role of the US. And that, I think, has some dangers, but it also opens up some opportunities. And the last thing I'd throw out, which is back to the deficit meme, I think there might be a deficit of conviction in the opposite direction. I'm not saying those who advocate for current Israeli policies are not passionate, but I think there is a degree of flabbiness to what constitutes Israel advocacy today. I think it's difficult to defend a lot of what's going on. And I think you see a new generation with a whole different narrative on the Palestinian side and a different level of conviction. And that does give me hope, I would say.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to now turn to Palestinian lawyer, analyst, and former legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team, Diana Buttu. Diana, we've seen that we have Hanan Ashrawi on with us, which is an honor. And you and Hanan are two of over the last decade or two, one of the best known voices of the Palestinian experience. But one thing that we have seen over the last year is that for the first time, rather than having so many people talking about Palestinians are actually sharing their experience firsthand in the mainstream media. You wrote a beautiful piece in the New York Times yourself in May about your father's experience. Yeah. And what do you think about, do you think does that give you hope? What do you think are the consequences of people actually hearing directly firsthand from Palestinians about their lives under occupation? But also, and I think very importantly, one of the things that I think shocked people in May was seeing intercommunal violence in Israel between the 1948 communities and Israeli Jewish communities. But I think that was probably less surprising for you and other Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so I'd like for you to talk about that a bit as well, and how you see kind of this movement of solidarity between Palestinians wherever they are.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. And I really want to thank the USMEP and all of my co-panelists. And thank you also for mentioning Dr. Ashrawi, who's been a role model for not just for me, but for so many Palestinians, because of her grace and her ability to pave the way for so many of us to really carry our own voices with different experiences in a way that I think that wasn't the case beforehand. So I thank her very much as well. Speaking about Palestinian voices, I'm honored to be included in the list, but obviously that's a very short list. And there are definitely so many more people who have been so articulate and so fearless in their approach, not only to media, but with diplomats and so on, including the Mohammed al-Kurd, Mona al-Kurd, and others who have, despite everything, not living in a place of privilege or a place where things don't matter necessarily, that they've faced down not only their oppressors, but including the diplomatic community, sometimes calling to their attention their lack of inaction, and so it's very important for these voices to be heard. In terms of what the experience has been like, and in terms of hope, unfortunately, my father just passed away earlier this month, 3 weeks ago, and throughout his life, one of the things that he very much instilled in me was a sense of that it was important for people to hear what had actually happened during the Nakba and how the Nakba is ongoing. There is a tremendous amount of Nakba denial around the world, but in particular among Israelis. And it's either a Nakba denial or a sense that we just have to move on from the Nakba. And if you're somebody who's lived through the Nakba, if you've experienced it, or you're the child of somebody who has lived through it, you know that it isn't just an event that ends and that you move on from. And so what we saw in May of this year was, for people, particularly my late father, was very much a continuation of the Nakba, the violence that we saw being carried out through the streets of Haifa, through Lid and Ramle and all of these different areas, was for him something that had always been there, and it was simply just a question of the circumstances bringing it forward. So even though the people who were carrying out those acts were not the same individuals who carried out the Nakba, these were of course generations after, it was that same experience, that just in the same way that we can't ignore what happened in 1948, so too the Israelis, the generations who perpetrated the Nakba, also did not forget. And so in terms of where it is that I see hope, it is very bold to put the word hope in the title, but I do see hope. And Rebecca, the place that I see hope is among Palestinians. It's really that simple for me. I think about I think about the generations who have lived through, in particular Palestinians in Israel, generations who have lived through Israeli attempts to try to crush them. There have been attempts to try to crush the Arabic language. There have been attempts, these attempts are still ongoing. They try to make sure that Palestinian schools don't get as much funding. There's an attempt to crush the Arabic language at government institutions. Even with the passage of the nation state law, Arabic has been pushed down the ladder in terms of being no longer an official language. But it doesn't just stop at Arabic, it's also in terms of our identity. We just saw the other day at a soccer game, football game in Sakhnin, that there were Palestinians who had the Palestinian flag taken away from them for flying the flag at a soccer match. We've seen that Israel has instituted law after law to try to crush any form of Palestinian descent. And what's very important about these 6 NGOs that have been labeled as being terrorist organizations, in Israel's words, is that it also has extended under Israeli law for those individuals that work with those organizations inside 48. In other words, the attempt has been for the past 73 years to crush us as Palestinians, to turn us into good Israelis or good Arabs, as they would like to say. And instead, we've seen, rather than people turning into the good Israelis, that instead they're very proud Palestinians. Attempt after attempt has been pushed back, and we do very much see a growing understanding and recognition that the only way forward is for the rights of all Palestinians to be addressed. Now, I'm also hopeful because of what we continue to see in Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, but also in the diaspora. It's been a nonstop attempt to try to get rid of us. And one thing that Palestinians have time and again have said is that we're not going so quietly. We're going to stay. We're going to stand proud. And once again, I think that that is very much the result of so many years of people putting their voices forward, despite the retaliation that people end up facing as a result. And so once again, I thank everybody who has continued along this path.
Thank you, Diana, and condolences, of course, on your father's passing. I'm going to turn to Peter now, and with that turn, a turn back to some of the politics of Israel-Palestine in the United States. And Peter, you're an astute observer of this, both within the Jewish community and the larger kind of policy establishment. And I'm going to talk about a concept that you and I would be familiar with, which is PEP, Progressive Except for Palestine. And that's a concept where, you know, people who consider themselves liberal or progressive kind of check those values at the door when it comes to their analysis of US policy on Israel and Palestine. And I think we saw in May some cracks in that veneer. It's not, you know, the majority of the Democratic Party, but it mattered, I think, in Congress. I think there were real voices, both in the Senate and the House, that questioned that status quo. We didn't see that change filter up to the White House, but I think even the White House acknowledged that there is a bit of a shift, and that it's no longer acceptable in some quarters of the progressive community, even outside of the foreign policy institutions, to kind of say that you're a progressive and check your values on this issue. So where do you see that leading? Do you think that's something that's real? Does it grow? Or do you think that's something that just peters out? And do you think it can lead to real change in terms of US policy?
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. And I wanted to just say, in addition to honoring, you know, if we're talking about our elders, the kind of avot and imahot, as we would say in Judaism, I want to mention, not only in addition to Hannah Shra, we mentioned that I'm really honored that Henry Siegman is here. You know, one of the things you learn if you're an young American Jew coming up who cares about Palestinian human rights is that in the previous generations, our best leaders, our strongest moral voices were pushed aside, did not get the recognition they deserved, and people who didn't have their set of moral principles were given the positions that they should have held. And for me, Henry Siegman Henry Siegman represents that. And I find you know, the struggles that he went through in the 1970s and 80s very, very inspiring to me. Also, I'm grateful that the USMEP put my Substack in the chat. I'm also just going to put Jewish Currents, the publication that I write for as well, if folks are interested in checking it out. I think that Progressive Except Palestine is definitely a kind of perspective that is waning in American media and in American popular culture, but remains fairly strong in Washington. And the transmission mechanism from public opinion writ large and popular culture and media to Congress is not a simple transition mechanism. It's very blocked in the way that on many issues it is. I mean, look at gun control in the United States, right? 90% of Americans want gun control, right? It can't get, our political system has very strong anti-democratic features, and those anti-democratic features are becoming stronger and stronger. So that one has to be careful about thinking there can be, Washington can remain in a bubble for a long time, even after you see real shifts. I think the real shifts that we saw crystallized, you know, in the spring, partly have to do with the way that the Black Lives Matter movement forced people in media to become more cognizant of questions of representation that they had been, made people in the media more embarrassed about the fact that so often certain groups of people were being talked about and not being talked with and not being heard from. And I think that focus on representation meant that there was a new kind of embarrassment that had not been there about the fact that it was so common to have people talking about Palestinians without any Palestinians there. And so we started to see a bit of a shift on this kind of center-left publications and networks. I also think that the fact that Palestinians had responded to their exclusion by working so hard to develop a voice on social media ultimately ended up mattering, because the gap between social media and establishment media has also been bridged to some degree. The two have fused, right? A lot of editors at the New York Times and people at MSNBC spend their day on Twitter, right? So if you develop a huge following on Twitter, it becomes a backdoor into the establishment media. We've seen that as well. And I think that is part of what produced the shift. I think the other reason for the shift is that the polarization in American politics has meant that any bipartisan perspective is very hard to maintain. And Progressive Accept Palestine was, in a sense, that. It was, the whole model for AIPAC's model has always been that you bring the Democratic leader and the Republican leader in Congress to give the same speech, right? But that has essentially breaking down in general as for a variety of reasons, the ideological divide between the two parties has grown on everything. So just to give you like a small little anecdote about how this plays out, I have a relative on my wife's side who's a longtime AIPAC donor, a Democrat, but like a lot of other people in the American Jewish community, she gives money to synagogue, she gives money to the Federation, she gives money to AIPAC. And she told me a year or two ago, under the Trump era, she said, when the AIPAC person called to ask for money, this relative through marriage said, but you're not going to give any of the money to Republicans, are you? Now, that's the whole point of AIPAC, right, is to be a bipartisan, but for her, all of a sudden, the notion that she could be supporting Republicans became completely anathema in the era of Donald Trump. And I think this is part of what's shifting some people in the Democratic Party at the grassroots to think about aligning their perspective. We've had a Israeli leader for more than a decade, Benjamin Netanyahu, who essentially codes to American progressives like an American Republican, like the Republican senator from New York, right? First, he seemed like the Israeli Dick Cheney, then he seemed like the Israeli Donald Trump. And so the notion that you could be opposed to Dick Cheney and Donald Trump, but yet basically give Benjamin Netanyahu a carte blanche, I think that whole nexus was really destabilized by the parallelism. You saw it on Netanyahu testifying for the Iraq War, then Netanyahu kind of, pushing America into this disastrous hawkish policy on Iran. I think all of these things have had this impact in popular culture. And we are also, and I think this last point, we are in an age of progressive activism in the United States in a way that was not the case in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. And that progressive activism is very self-consciously trying to essentially push on question after question, push outside of the boundaries of what were considered acceptable on the left in the Obama Clinton years, right? Look, you see Bernie Sanders is kind of, or AOC are great examples of this. So they are also pushing past the boundaries. And I think what you will likely see, I think, in media and popular culture is they're a push beyond the two-state boundary, beyond two-state discourse. Already in polling, it's pretty clear. If you ask Democrats, do you support one equal state or the one state we have now? They support one equal state overwhelmingly. Many of them support one equal state even over two states, if that were possible. And so I think it will move in that direction. The question is, do politicians who generally tend to be the last people to get on board, with a few courageous exceptions, do they feel like the politics have shifted enough so that the pressure they're getting from their left starts to feel equal to the pressure they're getting from their right? And even among most Democrats in Congress today, that's not yet the case.
Daniel, let me ask, because we've had a question from the audience about this concept of PEP in Germany, but let me ask you more broadly, since you're based in London, is this a similar dynamic in the UK and in Europe, and do you see similar shifts?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's recognize that European policy is so much less consequential when it comes to the impact that has on the ground. So there is a high degree of deference to monopolistic American leadership of this file in the international arena. And, I think there were moments when America kind of said to the Europeans, you step up. It didn't say this directly, but I think there was an element in the Obama era when it was like, we're not holding you back. If you want to try and generate more holding to account of Israel, go ahead. And Europe wasn't there for that. And then you had the flip side under the Trump administration, where it was, if there was a moment to step up and say, hey, wait a minute, we're not on board with this. This is totally rewriting at least the rule book, which we claim to adhere to. Again, Europe was more absent than present. So just to acknowledge that reality of the global politics around this. Then in terms of the debate inside Europe, I think there are similarities and differences, and I won't spend long on it. But the main thing I would say here is the starting point in America for the recalibration of how the issue is approached in the public discourse, in media, in what we were just hearing about. The starting point looked very, very different. I think in Europe, and certainly in the UK, it was the reverse. There was a high degree of sympathy with Palestine as a cause, which should be viewed as other causes. And I think there was a conscious effort to shift that. I think that's certainly a story of what's gone on in the UK. It is different in Germany. And you know, Germany requires several webinars of its own. But we have a plan for that, to quote a rather wonderful American senator. And there are people, if people are familiar with this document that came out earlier this year, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which was an attempt at a reset after several years of the IHRA definition and the working examples, and how that was used, and I think designed and instrumentalized. I mean, by design, it was used to try and silence Palestinian political speech, silence legitimate criticism of Israel, of the system, of the history. So this was an attempt to say, hey, wait a minute, you're conflating, you're undermining the struggle against anti-Semitism. You're actually making anti-Semitism a tool in the hands of a right-wing cultural war, which is going to have a bad blowback for Jews and for racial justice in general. So that effort is an important effort. It's especially important in places like Germany, but really hard. And in Germany, you have many things that feed into this. One of them, by the way, is the influence of the Springer media empire, which should now be under greater scrutiny everywhere because Springer just bought Politico. And I think that creates new vulnerabilities and exposures, which hopefully people will pick up on. But what I would say is that some of this phenomenon that we've been hearing about in America is true elsewhere, but it's a very different starting point. And there is a very important need to reframe the conversation around what is and is not anti-Semitism in order to be able to break through on that. That is, I think, very unfair to Palestinian advocacy to have to kind of go through that. But I think it's almost become a given.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to ask a question from a dear friend of all of us, Rami Khoury, that stays on kind of this question of who's advocating in the United States and internationally on this issue. And the question is about evangelical communities and the influence that they've had. Rami's asking if to Peter, do you think that their impact is waning, or do you think that it's kind of remaining in the status quo? And then Daniel and Diana, if you have anything to add on the influence of American evangelicals.
There are some people who think who will look at polling showing that younger white evangelical Christians have more progressive views on this issue and on other issues. And there are people like Greg Khalil at Telos who are doing really good work here. But I would be cautious about the optimism. I think part of the problem with framing this as about white evangelicals is it makes us think about people in a religious category. Whereas I think one of the lessons of the Trump era is that white evangelical in the United States is more a racial category than it is a religious category. And people get caught up with theology, but really, I think that a huge driver of the affection, of the support for Israel on the American right today is really about the fact that Israel represents a kind of model for what a lot of people in the Trump Republican Party want America to be, which is essentially what they want is an immigration policy that maintains hierarchies and demographic balances that they feel are imperiled in the United States. And Ann Coulter, who is arguably, in a way, the thinker, quote unquote, who has had the biggest influence on Trump, says this very explicitly. She says, we want Israel's immigration policy. If you look at Israel, neoliberal on economics, obsessed with sovereignty, hostile to international law, with a series of hierarchies that are enshrined in law and protected by an immigration policy. I think that's really what a lot of people in, white evangelicals want. And it's less because they're evangelical, because a lot of white Catholics who vote for Donald Trump want it as well. It's because they see it as the answer to the things that they fear in the United States. And actually even more, from my mind, kind of, extremely disturbingly watched. We now have a rising generation of Republican Jewish politicians, like Josh Mandel in Ohio, or Lee Zeldin, who's going to run in New York, who kind of bring that together even more explicitly, right? In the way they talk about a Judeo-Christian nation, which means a nation that will exclude Muslims. So I don't, unfortunately, necessarily see a lot of evidence that this is waning in power.
Yeah, I'm from Ohio. Let me zoom this back to the region and kind of talk about some of the, Deanna, I'm going to ask you specifically about 2 points where I think some nuance is missing in terms of the analysis in DC that I'd like you to provide. The first is, and I've heard senators say this, that, well, this is great. For the first time ever, Israel has an Arab party in the coalition. This is an unabashed good thing. And the second is the Abraham Accords, and that this is, again, like a great thing because the Arabs are making peace with Israel, and who could be against peace. So can you talk about those two kind of phenomenons and inject, maybe a bit of a reality check?
I'll do my best. Thanks, Rebecca. So first, this isn't the first time that there's been an Arab party in the coalition. Just that's a factual error. There were also when Yitzhak Rabin became prime minister, and with the signing of the Oslo Accords, we also saw that the Arab parties served as a blocking bloc, which was to say that they wanted to make sure that the coalition remained in power. And given that they wanted to make sure that the coalition remained in power, they effectively served alongside of, they want to make sure the government remained in power. They served as a coalition to block any attempts to bring down that government, because as a parliamentary system, if the government doesn't get the required number of votes to pass any form of legislation, the government automatically falls. In the 90s, these Arab parties also served as an attempt to try to make sure that the government remained in office. So that's just a factual mistake. So it's not the first time. That said, there are some real problems to this particular party. And first, this is not a party this Arab party is not actually in the government, which is to say that they aren't ministers within the government. And the reason is that there still is very much a sense among Palestinians in Israel that they don't want to be serving in a government of occupation, because what it means to be joining a coalition is that you're going to be signing off on the bombs that get dropped on the buildings in Gaza that kill kids. It means that you're going to be part of a government that signs off on the demolition of Palestinian homes, demolishing the homes that belong to kids as well, and that you're going to be part of a government that is approving the theft of land and the construction of settlements. So there's still very much a sense that Palestinians don't want to be in that space. That said, this particular government, they were in effect, putting it nicely. In their minds, they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. If they didn't join the Bennett-Lapid coalition, the fear was that it was going to go once again to Netanyahu. And I really think we cannot underestimate we cannot underestimate just how detrimental Netanyahu has been to Palestinians. We were his #1 target. Palestinians, all Palestinians. And he spent 12 years making sure that he aimed at this target. He was the prime minister who had not only pushed forward annexation, but made it kind of legit, but he was also the person who passed the nation state law. He was also the person who pushed for the moving of the embassy, pushed for Golan Heights, you name it. So for this particular Arab party, they were stuck between the rock and the hard place, the rock of having Netanyahu come back into power, and the hard place of being a member within this government. This current government is one that is facing a lot of problems, and what Mansour Abbas, the person who's part of the Islamic movement, the head of the Islamic movement, is now demonstrating is that you can't be that there is never going to be a place where Palestinians are welcomed into the Israeli landscape. It's a fiction, and that's one thing that he has highlighted very well. He's still remaining in the coalition, but public opinion polls are showing very much that they're opposed to his remaining in this coalition, and instead people are saying the only reason that he should remain is because it prevents another election and it prevents Netanyahu from coming to the fore. In terms of so I wouldn't read any more into it. All to say, I wouldn't read anything into it except to say that this was a political party that took a calculated decision that they wanted to make sure that Netanyahu was out of politics for the next few years. But we also know very well that this is not a government that's going to do anything for Palestinians. We haven't seen anything yet in the months in which they have been in office, and I don't think we're going to see anything for as long as this coalition remains. Palestinians remain at the very bottom of the spectrum. The second part about the Abraham Accords, I also think is very important for us to keep in mind what these agreements are. These are not peace agreements between these various countries and Israel. These are very much business relations, business dealings. And we've seen that the people of Bahrain have spoken, the people of the United Arab Emirates have spoken, the people of Sudan, all these countries have come out and spoken against what their governments have done. Now, was there a political calculation? They wanted to have better economic ties with Israel. They wanted to have better security ties and to be able to buy Israeli weaponry. That's probably the case, but I wouldn't read more into it. And it's certainly not a peace agreement by any stretch of the imagination. All of the political polls, the opinion polls that we're seeing coming out from these various countries that have quote unquote normalized relations are pointing to the opposite, where we see close to 90% of people being opposed to these. Again, these were simply economic arrangements, security arrangements, oftentimes between despotic regimes and Israel, and nothing more than that. I would not look to that as being a future model for cooperation, because to somehow think that you can exclude Palestinians is ignorant, to put it mildly.
Daniel, do you want to add to that? I mean, it was kind of an express goal of the Trump administration to make these peace agreements so that they could kind of bypass the need for Israel to actually make peace with Palestinians. But the Biden administration has kind of reaffirmed these Abraham Accords. Like, what is your view on, is there anything to build on, or?
Well, I mean, my view is that I'm fine with people having relations, states having relations, and, you know, being in dialogue. I think it's better than not being in dialogue. But if you put these in the context in which they emerged and that they were designed to serve, this very consciously was a Netanyahu narrative of peace for peace, as he called it. This was very much Netanyahu saying, you were being told for decades by this funny collection of people who believed we have to deal with the Palestinians, that if we didn't, Israel would find itself in a perilous state, we would be shunned, we would face problems in the region. Look at what I've managed to deliver. I have managed to bring about a combination of doing whatever I want to the Palestinians, the most egregious set of policies, and improving Israel's international standing, including, and most of all, in the region with Arab states. So this was designed to be deployed against the Palestinians. And when that's the design of something, you can't turn a bridge into a chocolate pudding. So, and given that that was the design of the Abraham Accords, you can't turn it into something that serves this cause. Now, I don't like the fact that it's woven into arms sales. I don't like the fact that it's woven into all kinds of spyware. I don't like the fact that they've formed an alliance to advance coups in the region. But fundamentally, relations are okay, not when they're designed to serve this particular purpose. And we haven't seen action in this respect yet from the Biden administration. I fear we might. What I don't expect is what we saw, where American national interests were played with in a very fast and loose fashion in order to bring these agreements to the fore. So, on Sudan, it was an appalling way to treat the Sudanese after everything Sudan has been through. You have this democratic process, and it was designed to, and has subsequently, in very palpable ways in the last few weeks, been part of the undermining of that process, and of course what was done with Western Sahara. But at the end of the day, it's what Diana said. Israel can have peace with whoever it wants, while the Palestinians are still there on the ground, while the Palestinians are still going to argue and assert and struggle and campaign for their rights to be recognized. It really doesn't change the fundamental balance.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to turn it back to Peter, and I'm going to try to combine a few of the questions that we've received. And they kind of have a theme, which is, we've talked a little bit earlier about Palestinians kind of speaking in their own voice, but also that there's kind of renewed, activism on behalf of Palestinians, even outside of the Palestinian community itself. And those things coincide with two important things that I'd like you to kind of comment on. The first being this move to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, and what that does to critics of Israel in terms of their advocacy, but also the recent designation of 6 very prominent and very well-known Palestinian NGOs as terrorist organizations. And, as you know, the Israeli government was here in Washington kind of shopping around a dossier that had been widely discarded in Europe as not credible. But there doesn't seem to have been, it seems like in DC that the jury's still out, and that there isn't really a decision yet about which way to go. And so I'd like you to kind of comment on the confluence of these types of efforts to really squash both Palestinian voices, both in Palestine and Israel and here, and if you think that they're going to have an effect.
Yeah, I mean, I think the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which defines opposition to a Jewish state, gives opposition to a Jewish state as an example of anti-Semitism, which essentially turns all Palestinians into anti-Semites. And if all Palestinians are anti-Semites, then of course they don't deserve to have a political voice, or perhaps not even to be able to allowed to speak legally, which is of course, has been part of the impact of all of this, as illustrated in this new movie Boycott, for instance, which I'd suggest people take a look at. I think you can't understand that move without understanding it in the context of the death of the two-state solution. So as the two-state solution dies, it only becomes natural for people who believe that Palestinians deserve to be citizens of a country, deserves to be citizens of the country in which they live, right, to move to think about the fact that since Israel has created a one-state reality, that one-state reality should be a state for all its citizens, it should be one equal state. And that's a very difficult argument actually to respond to on the merits, especially to Americans whose own model or whose aspirations, progressive Americans, is the notion of a state for all its citizens. The notion of partition into two ethno-nationalist states really is not the kind of certainly in the progressive American tradition, is very alien to us, right? So this is a very natural move. And so I think it's in that context that then you move to the position to say, well, that can't be considered among the menu of potential options because it's anti-Semitism, because if you oppose Jewish national self-determination defined as a state that privileges Jews over Palestinians, you're anti-Semitic. So, and then the utter perversity of it, of course, becomes that the only non-bigoted position, therefore, that one can hold, given the one-state reality we have, is one state in which millions of Palestinians are either second-class citizens or stateless non-citizens, right? That's the non-bigoted position, right? Because the only other alternative is to consider it anti-Semitic. It really makes no sense. And if you look, and I've debated on this subject several times. On every level, even if you look at the empirical data we have about who holds anti-Semitic positions in the United States and in Europe, and you try to map that onto who holds anti-Zionist positions, they're generally not the same people, actually. The truth is that a lot of the people who express the strongest anti-Semitic positions in political organizations and just in public opinion polls actually are quite pro-Israel, right? Which is not a new story, right? Because essentially they're pro-Israel because they like the idea of homogenous hierarchical states. So they see Israel as good, but they're not necessarily so thrilled about Jews in their own country who are undermining the homogeneity and the hierarchy that they would like to see in their own states, right? This goes back to Arthur Balfour was both a Zionist and an anti-Semite. He was the prime minister when they passed the Aliens Act that stopped Eastern European Jews from coming in. It's an old story. So I think, but unfortunately, it's had a lot of success. Unfortunately, in terms of the calling the Palestinian human rights organizations terrorists and the Biden administration's response, it cannot be more obvious that the Biden administration's position on Israel-Palestine is essentially do whatever to the Israeli government, do whatever you want, but try not to embarrass us too much. Right? So it can stay out of the headlines, because frankly, we're not willing to expend any political capital, and we really just want to fight with China because that's the gravy train that virtually everyone in Washington is on right now. Can't everybody all of a sudden, 2 weeks ago, they were experts on fighting Islamist insurgency. Now they're experts on how to defend Taiwan and the South China Sea. It's like overnight, right? So what's funny is that even with that very low standard, the Bennett government seems to be having trouble meeting it, right? Because it still does these things that cause the Biden administration trouble, right? But there's no evidence whatsoever that I can see. If you look at the personnel in the Biden administration, you look at Joe Biden's history, that Joe Biden is going to court any political conflict. It seems pretty clear to me the lesson that he took from the first year of the Obama administration was that Obama should never have picked that fight with Netanyahu over settlements to begin with. Not that he didn't follow through, not that he didn't put results, but that he never should have picked it to begin with, and he's not going to make that same mistake from his perspective.
Deanna, I saw you shaking your head quite a bit, and you've spent a lot of your career both, in Israel and Palestine, and here in DC. So we'd love to hear from you as well on this.
I couldn't agree more. It is to the place now where, as Peter mentioned, that it's just turning a blind eye. And I think Peter and I were on a panel a while ago where we both said, this is before Biden was even elected, who's going to be the person who's going to turn around Trump's positions? And it certainly isn't going to be Biden. We've seen that already. We've seen that instead of the embassy being shifted back, that it's now been simply accepted. We've seen that was the same when it has happened when it comes to the Golan Heights. And slowly but surely, we're going to see a continued turning of the blind eye. We've already seen it, but acceptance of annexation, which is going to come up once again very soon as this coalition ends up having to confront its actual base. And so I agree with Peter. I don't see that anything is going to change in the near future when it comes to this administration, this U.S. administration, because the attention is completely elsewhere.
Daniel and Peter, I'll turn it now to you. We have 4 minutes left, and we have viewers from all over the world, so we will respect their time and end it in 4 minutes. Daniel, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, it follows on from what we've just heard, and where it takes me is, I think, a perhaps more realistic, achievable, and worthwhile goal is there something that's more along the lines of neutralizing America's negative role, not thinking of the US and US policy as the savior, but seeing in the removing of as long as America's thumb is on the scale of further tipping that asymmetry into we just don't know how to get out of this because of that. Can we say, okay, if America is out, then it means you don't veto everything in the Security Council. It means you don't put your diplomatic weight at the disposal of offering this comfort blanket to Israel, which doesn't help Israel, because it means Israel avoids the choices which eventually it will have to address, and it will address those under circumstances less propitious to Israel having options the longer this goes on. So I kind of think of America in those terms, and I don't want the blob, as the foreign policy establishment in DC should be called, and it is called by some people. I don't want the blob now to go off and treat us all to a global war with China, but I'd be happy if they were less obsessed with this question. And then that takes me in 2 other directions. One is, I think it's time for those of us who care about seeing fundamental change on Israel-Palestine, whether we come at that from my upbringing in terms of the Jewish values I was brought up with, what it means for me to live with the reality of a state, Israel, calling itself a Jewish state, delivering such an absence of values that I adhere to, depriving Palestinians of their rights and equality. For people who care about this, I wonder whether we should absorb the message that we're being sent by the US, which is, we're not going to be there for you, and be looking elsewhere, and especially looking at ourselves. And I see positive things in parts of the Israeli discourse which were not there in an earlier generation, and what Deanna has spoken to so eloquently in terms of on the Palestinian side. And finally, I do think this is something that we cannot dodge as a Jewish community. And I've taken inspiration from Peter, but Peter referenced Henry Siegman, and he's been my mentor, and the price that he paid on this. But that is the candle that must be held. We have a responsibility here. So let me close with that thought, and thanks to him.
Daniel, closing with so much hope. Peter will give you the last word.
The change won't come from the United States, but what I do think is that if there is a Palestinian movement with a strong political base calling for, within a kind of language of kind of loving defiance for equality and nothing less than equality, but equality that provides a home for Jews and Palestinians, I think that what we will see is that produces a response in the United States that could potentially change our politics. It has to come from Palestinians on the ground, because otherwise it won't even be on the front pages of the newspaper here. People won't have the ability to mobilize, but it can produce a response by people who are inspired by that. And I think what gives me hope is I see the way that when Palestinian activists and Israeli Jewish activists who are putting themselves on the line for a vision of freedom and equality, I see how inspiring they are to Americans, including young American Jews. And just as the way and that young American Jews who might be inclined to distance or disconnect or not care feel a sense, well, if these people are doing this heroic work in such difficult circumstances, I need to support them and stand in solidarity with them. Just like when people were getting their heads bashed in Mississippi in the 1960s, people in the north of the United States said, I need to stand in solidarity with them because they are my heroes, because they inspire me. And I think that combination, could have an important shift, an important effect.
Thank you, Peter, Deanna, and Daniel. And thank you to all of you for joining on behalf of the U.S. Middle East Project. We appreciated the lively chat room and the very important Q&As, and we hope to see you on our next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.